hit the button and then you can talk.
And you need to watch it off after you've spoken, otherwise.
Morning, Shiva.
Morning.
Morning, Fiona.
Morning.
Morning, Peter.
Good morning.
Morning, Hannah.
Good morning, everyone.
Test, test, 1, 2, 3.
Hello, Anne.
Good morning. I seem to have technical problems. Oh no, I'm there. Okay, I'm there. Thank you. Okay. Morning.
Hi, Jackie.
Thanks. Cheers. Hello.
Right, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the December Cairngorms National Park Association Authority Planning Committee meeting. For those members of the public joining us today, either virtually or in person, I am Chris Beattie, the convener of the CNPA Planning Committee. Today's meeting will also be streamed live on the Cairngorms YouTube channel. We seem to have an echo. Is it this one? Yeah. Okay. Sorry, we'll have a slight technical issue. Okay, that seems fine. Before we go any further with the meeting, I'm going to ask the clerk to the board to call a roll call.
Chris Beattie,
Good morning.
Jiva Blackett,
Yes, I'm here. Good morning.
Sandy Bremner,
Good morning, present.
Jackie Brereton,
Good morning here.
Peter Cosgrove,
Morning, present. Good morning.
Paul Gibb,
Here.
Hannah Grist,
Good morning.
Russell Jones, John Kirk,
Morning.
Bill Lobbin,
Yeah.
Lauren McCallum,
Morning.
Eleanor McIntosh,
Here.
Fiona McClayton,
Morning.
Steve Micklewright,
Yeah, I'm here.
Duncan Miller,
Morning.
Anne Ross,
Good morning.
Derek Ross,
Here.
Michael Williamson.
Present.
Okay, thank you. Members, to help move the business forward effectively, please keep your questions succinct and to the point and focus firmly on clarification of technical or planning issues. Once we've moved into the discussion phase of an application, it would be useful if members could indicate at an appropriate point if you're minded to put forward any proposal regarding the officer's recommendations. For members in the room, please raise your real hand to indicate that you want to speak. And for those joining us online, please raise your virtual hand. If you're joining virtually, please make sure your microphones are muted unless you're speaking to reduce feedback. And should any member wish to pull together an amendment to a motion on any of the items today, a breakout room is available and the details are on your board memo. And you will be joined there by Peter Ferguson, who's in attendance online. And I think that's that. So we have no apologies. There will be a slight change in the running order. Items 12 and 11 will be swapped around, but that comes at the end of today's agenda. I'd like to welcome Paul as our new Deputy Convener, Deputy of Planning. So welcome, Paul. Thank you very much for joining us. And we'll move on to item 2. Minutes of the previous meeting from the 8th of November and matters arising not covered elsewhere. Can I ask the committee if they are content with the accuracy of the minutes from the meeting on the 8th of November? Yeah, okay, happy to go along with that. And I'd be happy to approve these minutes. Yeah, that's great. Anyone wish to raise anything at all? Nope. Okay, so I'll move a motion to take the draft minutes from our confidential session on the 8th of November at the end of the public section. Item 3, matters arising. I have no matters arising from the previous meeting. Okay, so we'll move on to item 4, declarations of interest. Do any members wish to declare an interest on any of the items on the agenda today? And if you have an interest to declare, can you please be clear on the item number, the nature of the declaration, and whether you still wish to take part in the item on leave? Duncan.
Yeah, I sat out of the original for item 11. I sat out of the original planning decision for that like a year ago, so I'll be sitting out of item 11.
Okay, thank you very much, Duncan. Nothing online, that's fine. Right, so we'll move on to item 5. It's the only application for planning permission today, and this is number 2023/0455/DET. And this is the repair and upgrade of an existing estate track at Ballable House, Kingussie. And this is going to be introduced by Colin Bryans, our Senior Planning Officer and Development Manager. The officer recommendation is to approve subject to conditions. With no speakers today. So, Colin, would you like to lead us through the presentation, please?
Yeah, thank you very much, and good morning. So the application is, or the proposal is, to upgrade an existing rough 4x4 access track on the estate. And the purpose of the proposal is to aid the currently underway woodland restoration and landscape management programme that's happening across the estate. In terms of its location, the track runs from what is essentially the central spinal track of Ballyville Estate, running from the estate offices up the hill, and then our proposed track runs from this down towards, down towards the Rathsburn, and it's quite a steep gradient, kind of going from that central track to the Rathsburn. This maybe give you a bit of an idea better of the topography. So there's quite a drop, and then it flattens out, and then there's quite a steep drop down to the burn itself. The details of the proposal: the applicant has provided this typical cross section of the track construction. Now it is a typical cross section. It differs at different points, but more or less where it makes sense to construct the track along these lines, that's what we're seeing on the site. And I should have said that this proposal is in part retrospective. For the most part, this proposal has already been built out. This is the track in situ at the moment, and you can see this maybe gives you a better idea of how the topography drops down towards the burn. You can see the Rathsburn there towards the bottom of the picture on the left. The typical cross section includes the replacement of turf either side of the track, but also a turf and seed mix along the centre of the track, so a central green strip essentially. Obviously, that has not been implemented on the scheme as built out currently. This is looking back up, so we're sitting kind of down at the Rathsburn, looking back up the existing track. And this is probably a good point to talk about the amendments. So when we were out on site, it became evident that the track as built was being eroded quite badly at this point, where it drops straight down the hill. So essentially it goes straight down the contours. It's probably a combination of water runoff, but also the 4x4 track vehicles, kind of their wheels spinning and churning up the track. Essentially the gradient is too steep. And the amendment which we've asked for is for the track to take an earlier turn, essentially. So instead of going straight down the hill to the flat, it's going to take an earlier turn and cut across the gradient, or cut across kind of contour down at a less steep gradient. So that's the element of this proposal which is not retrospective, and which, if approved, we would want to see built out in accordance with the plans that have been submitted. This is a plan for the wider woodland regeneration that's on the site, and you can see the red circle there, which is the location of our proposal. Difficult to read at the scale it's at, but what you're seeing there is the uncoloured bit and the pink bit is essentially going to be maintained as open ground, and then the purple piece, which is quite widespread, but at our site kind of runs along the Rathsburn corridor, is allocated for kind of broadleaf replanting and regeneration. So our track will be viewed against a mixture of kind of this broadleaf replanting area, but also kind of open ground the way it currently is. So in terms of the considerations for this proposal, in principle, the proposal is the upgrade of pre-existing track. So a track has been existing in this location for quite some time. The principle of a track at this site is therefore kind of pre-established and acceptable. It's now going to be, or in the future, from this point on, we're just going to be viewed within the context of the woodland area that it's going to be it's situated within, so it's not an open moorland as it would have been in the past. In terms of design, the dimensions and the upgrade of the track are typical of this type of development, as are the materials. The materials are one from the the existing borrow pit, which was considered and approved at committee back in August. Once the green strip is laid and is taken on it, it's going to help to ensure that the track sits more naturally within its landscape. You know, a new track is always going to be a bit more visually intrusive than a pre-existing old track, but I think the combination of the turf replacements, the green strip regeneration, and the fact that it will be viewed within the context of the woodland replanting scheme is kind of going to mitigate that visual impact. Likewise with the landscape, you know, the fact that it's going to be viewed against this kind of replanting scheme, and that's going to mature as time goes on. I think its landscape impacts are going to lessen as time goes on, and as the track matures, and as the green strip and the replanting or the returfing elements of it mature that wee bit further. Environmental impacts, in terms of ecology impacts, our ecological officer raised no objections to the proposal. It's not considered to have any significant impacts on the environment or biodiversity. In terms of biodiversity net gain, there's none specifically included within this proposal. But again, given that the track itself is part of the wider natural woodland regenerative programme, I think it's reasonable to accept that in the broader terms, biodiversity net gain is being delivered through that replanting programme. Cultural heritage at this site. You can see there are some archaeological remains on the site, so essentially kind of in and around this area of the Rathsburn there's evidence of habitation in the past, and it's a retrospective application, so there's limited recourse here, but we have consulted with our archaeological consultees, and the recommendation to approve includes the recommendation of a condition where we would expect a written scheme of investigation to be submitted within 3 months of the date of any decision, and any recommendations of that written scheme of investigation to be delivered in the delivery of building out the proposed development. So, to summarise, it is unfortunate that the application is retrospective, at least in part, but based on the design, based on its siting, based on the fact that there was a pre-existing track there, and subject to that recommended condition on archaeological written scheme of investigation, our recommendation is to approve.
Okay, thank you, Colin. Eleanor.
Yeah, can I ask about your suggestion that the track be reprofiled? Should we not be conditioning that fact, and like I presume you want reinstatement of the existing line?
Yes, so we would want reinstatement of the. Do you mean removal of this? Yes, I don't think a condition is appropriate, and I'm happy to discuss this with whoever. But I think if this application is approved as recommended, then any element that isn't included within the design that was submitted is not. It's not approved. It's on an unapproved development. It would be subject to enforcement action if it wasn't reinstated. If I'm making any sense to you, you know, it would essentially, that bottom bit that we're looking to be moved further up would be an unapproved development, and it would be within the applicant to make that good. Otherwise, they'd be leaving themselves open to enforcement action.
Okay, maybe it's because I'm used to seeing more conditions, but I would have expected to see that as a condition, and also the fact that there's no green strip. I would have kind of thought it should have been conditioned as well, but I'm happy to take.
Yeah, Eleanor, the green strip has been proposed by the applicant in this application, so they have proposed to do it. So that's something that will be in. That is part of the approved application in this case. So we don't need to add it on because they've said they will do it as part of it. So that becomes part of the approved plans in effect. The section of track there that is on the screen just now was one of the sections that wasn't originally on the ground. So that is unauthorised development and is new unauthorised development. So it's not on top of an existing track line. So that will have to be removed afterwards, because it is unauthorised. So therefore it has to go, and we can take enforcement action if the estate don't remove it voluntarily.
Is there a time scale for that work then, and that removal? Because I mean, this estate has history, so I'm just making sure that what we're agreeing is what we're getting, and it's a bad day if we've got to rely on enforcement action, you know, to be delivering for us. I
think we can have a look at a condition that secures the removal. I mean, it's still in addition to other powers, but we can have a look at a condition that removes that section. We just need to think about the exact wording of that. But I'm happy to offer that we will put a condition onto this if the committee agree to approve it, that secures the removal of that section of the track as well. But with the proviso that there's still enforcement action that we could take as well.
Okay, we're going to have questions from Pete and then Michael.
Thank you. I recall from board discussions on wildfire management with Colin McLean that estate tracks are likely to become important strategic fire breaks in the landscape as we move forward. And whilst not wanting to preempt Colin's final fire management plan recommendations, he specifically mentioned that we will need to start thinking about these things carefully. And so I was a bit surprised to see no mention of wildfire management in relation to this track and its role, because if we're putting a green strip down the middle, this is one of the things that Colin highlighted that may in fact become problematical because it stops it functioning as a wildfire break, because fire can transfer across quite easily. So I just wondered, firstly, I didn't see anything in the new considerations element, anything about wildfire management, and this is for management that is going to increase the fuel loads considerably in this area. And I just think going forwards, is it possible for us to have wildfire considerations when we're looking at access tracks so that we can account for this?
I suppose it's the context of the current application. So the estate hasn't said that they're looking to use this track as a fire break or for fire management. At this point in time, there's a kind of some planting. There'll be some natural regeneration within this area as well, but it's some time before that's going to be a woodland. It's quite early days. So the green strip is to reduce the visual impact of the track just now in a fairly open landscape. There's nothing to stop the estate coming forward in years' time to say, look, we've got an issue with a green strip, or any estate to say that, look, circumstances have changed, this track is now within a wooded landscape, we don't think there's a need for a green strip, and our view is there's a fire risk there, and that we open to that to come back as an application, and then planning authority to consider whether or not it's necessary at that point in time. But certainly at this, you can see from that photo, this is a track created through lorries of material being put onto the ground and then driven over. It's not been done to the standards that they're showing in the drawings that they provided with the application. So it's to try and reduce the visual impact in the short term. I suppose the other thing to remember is obviously many of the tracks that exist across the national park end up with a green strip naturally, because the tyres run along those two strips, and the vegetation will come back through the middle. So the management of that becomes something that estates will have to think about anyway.
So that's fine for the context of this discussion. It's just also the second part was going forward, if we are looking at estate tracks in the future and we've been asked to think about wildfire management issues, would it be possible to have some consideration in the reports to that?
I think so. I think though we need the applicant to be telling us the purpose of the track and whether or not it's necessary. There's no planning policy around that part of it, and we're talking about 50 centimetres to a metre of vegetation within an area of lots of other vegetation. So whether or not I think we need an applicant to come forward and say why it isn't needed, rather than to say that we just don't need them at all, because obviously, depending on the strength of a fire, whether or not there's a green strip on it may make little difference to whether the fire spreads across a track.
Thank you. Michael. All about Derek.
Thank you. Is that working? Yeah, so I think picking up on what people have asked previously, but I think as the track starts getting used, it's likely to get potholes, so vehicles are going to start weaving backwards and forwards across the track. So putting a green strip in the middle might not stay there long term as vehicles move up and down the track. I think fundamentally my question is are we? You mentioned we're not going to specify how we're going to restore that piece of ground. I don't understand why we should specify that piece of how the ground's going to get repaired in order to fulfil the obligations of the new planning.
Do you mean in terms of a restoration scheme? Yeah, I mean it's something we could condition.
That's probably the easiest way that we condition it. So we'll add a condition which requires a restoration scheme for that section of track within 3 months of the consent, that is then implemented within 6 months of the consent, or something like that.
And will that be like for like? Because looking at your picture, it looks like there's a combination of heather and grass, or will you?
It will be the applicant to submit a restoration scheme that officers would then consider and discharge, as long as it's satisfactory restoration. So it'll be that material. In simple terms, that material needs to be removed, and then it either needs to be seeded or it needs to have turfs robbed and placed on it as well, in order to make the ground, give the ground as much chance as possible of returning to its relatively normal state.
Thank you. Derek.
Thanks, Chair. I'm looking at page 4 of the 12 and the history, and the history of retrospective planning from this estate, and I'm wondering if there's been dialogue with the estate reminding them of their responsibilities regarding planning and what the procedures are, because this is not the first time we've had this, and I don't think we should be encouraging this kind of behaviour.
Yes, Derek. If you remember, there were 2 retrospective applications from this estate in August of this year. So Chris wrote to the agents and managers in strong terms about it, reminding them of that. But we're not proposing to write to them again after this. We did mention at that meeting that there was another application that was part retrospective that was still to be considered by the planning committee. So they have been reminded, and we are doing other work with agents and with Scottish Land and Estates as well.
Perhaps we could write to them saying that this committee is concerned about these kind of retrospective applications.
I mean, Derek, you could do again. The letter that Chris sent was on behalf of the planning committee in August, so I think we've probably done it. I think the estate are aware of the committee's views and of the criticism that officers have given them directly about it as well.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Derek. I noticed that Peter Ferguson, you put your hand up for a bit and then put it down again. Is there something you want to come in on, Peter?
It's almost been addressed by the suggestion of a condition requiring restoration. But the point I wanted to make was, even though the area in question, the area to be restored, is outside the red line of the current planning permission, the land is still within the control of the applicant. So therefore, technically, it's possible and appropriate to include a condition for that land.
Thanks, Peter. So no more questions. We move into the discussion phase. Is there anything else that anyone wants to raise? No, nothing online. Well, in that case, are committee members content to take forward the officer's recommendation and approve the application with the additional conditions? Yeah. Okay. Everyone seems happy about that case. So, in that case, the application for detailed plan permission 2023/0455/DT, repair and upgrade of existing track at Balliol House, Kingsley, has been approved. Right, so now we'll move on to item 6. This is for decision, and this is the Planning Enforcement Charter Review. And it's going to be introduced by Ed Swales, our Monitoring and Enforcement Officer, and the recommendation is to approve the Planning Enforcement Charter. Ed, would you like to take us through this, please?
Yeah, thanks very much. Just a quick update to say that we've reviewed the charter. It's exactly the same as last year. And obviously the recommendation is to approve it. The addition in the appendices this year is the Planning Enforcement Circular, which is referenced within the charter itself. Obviously, we'll send it to Scottish ministers pending approval, and update the register online as well. But there's no additions or anything like that. So, yeah.
Thank you, Ed. Do you have any questions for Ed? Nothing online, nothing in the room. Okay. Move on to the discussion phase. Do any members wish to raise anything about this? Nope. Nothing in the room, nothing online. Okay, then, are committee members content to take forward the officer's recommendation? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. So we'll move on now to item number 7. This is also for decision, and this is the electricity infrastructure consenting in Scotland, proposals for reforming the consenting process in Scotland under the Electricity Act 1989. And this is going to be introduced by David, Head of Planning and Chief Planning Officer. And the recommendation is to approve our proposed response to the consultation as set out in your appendix. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So as you said, Chris, this item presents the Park Authority's proposed response to a consultation on potential reforms to the electricity infrastructure consenting processes in Scotland, and it seeks approval to submit that response on behalf of the Park Authority. And I should mention the consultation itself officially closed in late November, so a couple of weeks ago, but we've been told that we can submit a late response to enable us to bring this item to committee today for your consideration. Before I get into the substance as well, I just briefly wanted to point out a typo in paragraph 10 of the report, which refers to Scottish National Heritage, now known as Nature Scot. That reference, of course, should be to Scottish Natural Heritage, the former name there. So just to clarify that, apologies for any confusion around that. But turning then to the kind of more substance of the report, members will be aware that Scottish ministers determine applications for major electricity infrastructure projects, whether they be network projects or onshore generating projects over 50 megawatts in capacity, through their energy consents unit. So they're determined by Scottish ministers. But it's important to note that the legislation that underpins that and enables those determinations is UK legislation. And specifically, it's the Electricity Act of 1989, as you said there, Chris. Elsewhere in the UK, nationally significant energy infrastructure is consented under more modernised planning legislation, but that doesn't apply in Scotland. And in general terms, consents for major electricity projects in Scotland have taken longer to come through the system than elsewhere in the UK. And the UK and Scottish Government therefore proposed to make some changes to the Act to address that, to make the system more efficient, but also, importantly, to give communities and statutory consultees more meaningful opportunities to engage with that consenting process and to influence that as well. The proposed reforms are covering pretty much a whole spectrum of the application process and the consenting process. So they run through pre-application requirements, application procedures, public inquiries, variations to existing consents as well, fees for way leaves. There's also some stuff around statutory appeals, the process for challenging decisions, and transitional arrangements as well. There are summaries of all of those aspects within the covering report, but I'm not going to run through them all for the purposes of this presentation, just because there's an awful lot in there. But instead, I was just planning to concentrate on the first three elements: the pre-application requirements, application procedures, and public inquiries, because they're likely to be of most direct interest to the Park Authority and to sort of communities. So under pre-application requirements, sorry, that screen's gone off. The consultation proposes a couple of changes. Firstly, it proposes to introduce statutory pre-application consultation and notification requirements for these major infrastructure energy schemes. There is currently no mandatory provision around that at the minute. So the introduction of these measures would largely mirror the process elsewhere in the UK, but also it would be very much like the kind of pre-application requirements that are applicable to other major developments that are consented through the mainstream planning process in Scotland as well. So it largely mirrors that. And there's also a proposal for an acceptance stage at which Scottish ministers can decline to accept an application if it's failed to met those pre-application processes. And then moving on to application procedures, the proposals in this respect really are introducing minimum information requirements to support applications. So more information requirements, essentially. The intention here is that a lot of the detail on exactly what the information requirements will come through subsequent regulations, but they're likely to cover these kind of matters. So plans of showing the location of all the infrastructure that's proposed, a statement of pre-application engagement, statements of alternative approaches that have been considered in coming to the proposal, benefits and needs statement as well, and then a full statement of all the components that require consent, essentially. And there are also some measures around supporting consultees and statutory consultees to input into the process and engage with the process. Those kind of measures include ideas like a hub forum type provision whereby the Energy Consents Unit can then meet with statutory consultees, sharing good practice, look at potential common reasons for delays with applications and agree possible ways to sort of overcome those. So it's all based around facilitating that input into the process. And then the final thing that I was just going to touch on is the proposals around public inquiries. And that essentially involves the proposal to replace the existing public inquiry requirements within that legislation, within the Electricity Act, with a slightly more flexible reporter-led examination process. So at the moment, that public inquiry process is triggered if a planning authority or local authority objects to an application, and that automatically triggers a full public inquiry. The proposal is that there will still be an examination process that would apply in the event of an objection like that, but it may be more flexible. So it could involve a public inquiry in some instances, but it would be up to the reporter to determine whether alternative approaches like site inspection, further written submissions, or hearing sessions might be used as an alternative. And the views of relevant parties would be sought by the reporter in deciding the most appropriate approach. So that's the intention around those proposals, I think, is just to give a bit more flexibility as to how that examination process works. So the consultation itself asks a range of questions about the proposed reforms. Our responses to those questions, where relevant, because some of the questions probably aren't directly relevant to the Park Authority, but where relevant, our responses are set out in Appendix 1. Broadly speaking, our proposed responses are relatively supportive of the reforms, which we acknowledge will bring that level of consistency of approach with other mainstream major planning applications and the pre-application requirements, particularly around those. But we've also proposed a few more detailed comments as well. Recommendation is to approve the proposed response. But I'm happy to take any questions and open that up for discussion. Colin as well is available to feed into that. He's looked at this and has experience of using the system from the outside as well. So some good experience that he can bring to that too.
Thank you, David. Okay, so we have questions from Bill, Mike, and myself.
Mine is quite a simple question. I took part in the Highland Council debate on this. Am I allowed to take part in this? Maybe for Peter.
Yeah. Peter, could you come in on that? Because I think there's a few of us in the same boat.
It's a consultation response, and CNPA would be consulted on a different basis to Highland Council or other local authority areas. So it doesn't strike me as being a conflict. But so as long as the questions and comments are related to CNPA's focus, it's not a live planning application as such. It's a consultation response. So the decision will ultimately be the CNPA's decision. So I think a discussion from as wide a range of members as possible is appropriate.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Michael.
Okay, thank you. I thought you were going to come back in. Yeah, it's about the public inquiries, and I think that anything that we can do to beef up that we don't need to go into public inquiry, because I think the use of public inquiry disenfranchises communities who may want to challenge an application, and they therefore have to find the resources to get legal representation at that inquiry. So anything that can be done to move it away from public inquiries would be quite welcome, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I can come in on that just to say that the proposed response is broadly supportive of that, recognises that the public inquiry process can be, quite difficult for people to engage with, and also pretty costly too. So the proposal is not to necessarily do away with that altogether, but to provide that flexibility for a different approach if that was deemed to be the most appropriate under the circumstances. So at the minute, the proposed response reflects that. There may be other views.
Thank you, David. Bill, do you want to come in?
I completely disagree. I think this removes the ability of planning authorities to insist on a public local inquiry, and therefore the democratic process is diminished rather than that. And if you're talking about making benefits for communities, the idea that you should reduce the consultation period from 3 months as is to 6 weeks, I think is also wrong. This is to try and bring it into line with their existing offshore applications where it's 6 weeks, whereas at the moment onshore it's 3 months. So I think it should remain as 3 months. If they want to keep them both together, then yeah, make them both the same, make them 3 months.
Kenny, would you like to come in?
Yeah, well, my point's not related to that, but I get the feeling there might be more discussion on that. So the idea of consultation, help or support through this hub, that involves communities, I'm assuming, as a key consultee in that group, because I think under question 7, it talks about meaningful engagement, and I think a lot of smaller communities feel overwhelmed just by they're being courted and almost bullied by very sophisticated, highly paid, highly professional marketing teams from energy companies or whoever, and they're overwhelmed by it, and they're not being supported at the moment, in my view, by the national park necessarily, and we need to do more in supporting them. So if we can do that through a hub, maybe that's something I think we should look at.
Thank you, Kenny. So I've got Anne, and then I'll ask my question after Anne. Anne, would you like to come in?
Thank you. I was just going to support what Bill said. I think he's 100% right. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Anne. Well, my question is pretty straightforward. Will the pre-application consultation be carried out by the National Grid ESO?
Honest answer is I don't know the answer to that. My understanding is that the requirements would require the applicant to carry out and meet the requirements for a notification, public events. But yeah, honest answer is I don't know.
Okay. Thank you very much, David. So we'll move into this discussion phase if there are no more questions. Does anyone want to raise anything? Eleanor?
Yeah, I support what Bill says, but I also acknowledge, having taken part in a public inquiry, that it's immensely expensive. It's an really difficult place to be, and really impossible for communities. So is there not some way of putting forward a different kind of solution? Because I agree, I mean, we've had mixed experiences with the reporters unit. I would just like to see a sort of middle ground between a public inquiry and the reporters unit, and something that's less formal than a public inquiry, but still comes under the democratic rights of the planning authority. I just think we've got an opportunity to make a different kind of response rather than just agree or disagree one way or the other.
Thank you, Eleanor. Derek?
I'm with you on that. I mean, having experience of the public inquiries, they are adversarial. They're not an inquiry. I agree also with Bill insofar as that timeline would make it very, very difficult for communities to respond. A 6-week window of response. So yeah, I agree with Eleanor. I think there has to be some kind of middle ground, and we need to be at public inquiries. We need to be throwing out what was the QCs, but throwing out the KCs and making it an inquiry rather than a court case almost. And that's what's discouraging. I mean, it's discouraging for officers apart from anything else, because they feel they're on the, they're in court almost, because that's the way it's conducted. But so if it's very difficult for officers in that situation, what's it like for people from the communities who've had no experience of this kind of format before? No, I absolutely agree with Eleanor.
Bill?
I think Eleanor makes a very good point, as does Derek. I think the problem is that when you have a PLI, what you've got is is quite capable of officers representing the authority as part of a PLI. But for an ordinary member of the community, it's nigh on impossible. So maybe the format of this is wrong, but what we don't want to see is these automatically going to a single reporter who then sits and makes decisions about local community, knowing nothing about the local community. And we ourselves as an authority have fallen foul on that on numerous occasions when I suppose planning authorities have decided one way to be overturned by a reporter. So I don't know how you do this, Eleanor, but maybe we should be suggesting that there should be a way.
Back to Derek.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the system lacks democratic accountability. And that's, and that's, it lacks democratic accountability at the moment, the whole system. And really the system needs an overhaul so that people feel more comfortable within the system. I mean, I've agreed with everything that Bill said and everything that Eleanor said about it. I mean, there's defects in the system at the moment, and those defects need to be addressed in the interests of communities.
Gavin.
Yeah, I mean, I think understand the points that people are making. I suppose there's a couple of different things. Currently, local authorities, not park authority, local authorities have a kind of a degree of power in the system that they can influence, which triggers the public inquiry. And then we go into that process that we all think is not ideal for other public engagement within it. Obviously, the proposals are to push for a reporter-led process, which is more like as the planning process has become, which tries to make it easier for members of the public to engage with it and more appropriate, less having QCs cross-examining members of the public, which is very intimidating and basically a bit unfair. Obviously, members are concerned that that still happens. I wonder if rather than us trying to, we're not the ones to fix this, but we can make the point that the Park Authority is concerned that whatever is proposed, it's a process that helps the public get involved meaningfully in it, rather than creates that adversarial environment where they're kind of discouraged from it.
And can we somehow word something in it that points out the fact that we don't like the idea of the centralisation of planning powers?
Well, I think that's a tricky one, because they're not talking about changing anything in terms of the centralisation of these decisions, because these decisions are already taken by ministers.
But we're removing the power but they're removing the power of authorities to have a public local inquiry, which is always a problem for them. That's the part of it they don't like. And they're basically just trying to shorten the timescale. They could easily shorten the timescale by getting rid of the energy consents unit.
Well, I guess that's something for you all to talk about and decide what you want us to respond with on that matter. We're not proposing to suggest any changes to that as part of this. So if members want to do that, then I think you need to come up with some words to help us with that.
Paul. Yeah, thanks. So when I was reading this, I was wondering during the pre-application consultation phase, if the community are being engaged and they're not satisfied with the proposals, are they able at that point to stop the process and have a review that something is put forward that's more acceptable? When do the breaks happen at that early phase, such that it doesn't get approved and move on?
Well, it would be down to the reporter, I think, to decide whether or not, well, the reporter on behalf of Scottish ministers, it's effectively Scottish ministers' decision to decide whether or not the applicant had undertaken sufficient pre-application work and was able to evidence that they followed the process sufficiently well. It wouldn't be for the community to decide whether that was satisfactory to them.
Well, I'm not questioning the professionalism. It's more, if the community were opposed, when do they have they're not satisfied with this plan, but is their voice listened to at that pre-application stage, such that it doesn't then move on and it becomes an application that they can no longer support, and it's destined for the reporter?
I think that obviously a community or groups would be able to make representations on the sufficiency of that evidence at that stage, but whether or not Scottish Government decide they agree with the opinion of a community, I don't know. I mean, I don't think we can prejudge that. It's possible they would, or they might not.
Can I ask another quick question? What's the deadline for this submission? No. I mean, we've got an additional time. How much time?
It's clearly a late submission. It was the request that I put in was to have a discussion at this committee and then obviously submit the responses after that. So I would suggest that if we want to, and there certainly would be scope to potentially look at alternative wording for the response under, I would say, question 2 under the public inquiries element. So that's on page 5 of your report. Certainly scope to agree that, but I think we would want to bottom that wording out pretty quickly so that we could submit our response and have that considered. But more than happy to.
Can we agree the bit about the reduction in the lead time from 3 months to 6 weeks?
Yeah, is that in relation to the judicial review and the statutory kind of challenge process? Yeah. So at the moment there's a kind of differentiation between whether it's an offshore or an onshore scheme, and the timescale for bringing
offshore it's 6 weeks and onshore it's 3 months, and they're trying to make them both the same. Well, make them both the same if you want to, but make them 3 months rather than.
If members would, if members are in agreement with that, we can reflect that in the response. Yeah. So this is the timescale for bringing a challenge to the decision after it's been made.
But some community councils don't meet every 4 weeks. So.
Question from John.
Just thinking this through, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Rather than a public inquiry, some sort of ombudsman type thing that would meet, make it easier for communities to get their message across rather than go to the full public inquiry. I don't know whether that can be done.
We've got Peter online and then Sandy.
Thanks. The public inquiry piece, there's part of this is just down to language, because in the Electricity Act, it provides that if there is an objection from the planning authority, there is a public inquiry. Now, public inquiry is used in a different sense with planning appeals. So with planning appeals, where there is some sort of oral session, that's referred to collectively as a public inquiry. But within the umbrella of that term, public inquiry, there can be inquiry sessions, which are the formal cross-examination of witnesses, or there can be hearing sessions, or there can be community sessions. So the problem that the lack of flexibility at the moment is because the legislation refers to a public inquiry. And some developers insist in these Electricity Act cases that public inquiry means an inquiry session. And that's where the lack of flexibility comes in. Whereas if the legislation simply said there will be a public hearing, then that would remove the inflexibility and create the flexibility to the DPEA reporter to decide on the basis of an individual case what's the most appropriate session. I was involved in, I won't go into the details, but I was involved in a case about 4 weeks ago where technically it was called a public inquiry, but all of the sessions were hearing sessions. And compared to previous formal public inquiry sessions, most participants, I think, found it, particularly the community groups, found it a more user-friendly approach. So perhaps if the members' preference is to still have some form of public hearing, then that could be fed into the consultation response.
Thanks, Peter. David, would you like to come back on that?
If that is the consensus view, then absolutely, we can reflect that and suggest that as a kind of form of wording change to the legislation that would meet concerns around the adversarial nature of that, but yet still retain the democratic accountability piece. So very happy to reflect that wording and suggest that wording in the appropriate response. I can either just make that change, or I could agree it with yourself, Chris, and Paul after the meeting, and then submit based on that.
Okay, happy to do that. Just one more point from Sandy.
Yeah, just on the specific point we were discussing, I think there's a degree of unanimity among the committee, and wondering if we can agree as a committee to the 6 week, sort of the 6 month, the arrangements for response being equated to offshore rather than new onshore proposals, and if we can agree on that as part of our response.
3 months rather than 6 weeks.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
Everyone happy with that? Peter, you would like to come back?
Yes, I just want to clarify there are two different concepts which may be becoming confused here. as things stand at the moment for Electricity Act cases, there is no pre-application consultation. Now, as members will know, with regular planning applications for major development, where it's major development, that triggers a requirement for the developer to undertake pre-application consultation, and the planning application would be accompanied by a pre-application report. And to pick up Paul's point, the pre-application report, the development doesn't necessarily need to change in response to the pre-application, but the developer needs to explain why, if it hasn't changed, why it hasn't changed. So there's the pre-application piece, and what's being proposed is something new being added for Electricity Act cases. I'm not aware, but I may not have picked up this detail, I'm not aware from the consultation that any particular period has been specified for that consultation. The other issue with the 6 weeks and the 3 months is to do with, if one of these Electricity Act consents is granted, it's the period for parties opposed to it to challenge it in court. And at the moment, there is a mix between 6 weeks and 3 months, and the proposal is to make those periods equivalent. So I may have missed this, but I don't think the 6 weeks, 3 month piece relates to pre-application consultation. I think it relates to the judicial review period.
Right. David, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, just to echo that, I think that's what we were mentioning before, Bill, that distinction applies at the very end of the decision-making process, and it applies to the time limit for bringing essentially a legal challenge to that decision, whether that should be made within a 6 week period or a 3 month period. Exactly as Peter said, I think that's the point in the process where that distinction is made. If there's a consensus view that should be the 3 month period consistently rather than 6 weeks, then we can reflect that in the consultation response.
Eleanor.
It was just to say, will the reasoning for our reasoning be included in the response, i.e. a lot of community councils don't meet every 6 weeks, 4 weeks.
Okay, I don't see anyone else online, nothing more in the room. So are we happy to take forward the officer's recommendation with and change to the wording under that section? Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, thank you very much. So we'll move on to item number 8. This is for information. This relates to application 2022/0305/DET, Rexley 21 dwellings at Nethy Bridge Station Road, Nethy Bridge, and Scottish Minister's decision. And it's going to be introduced by David again. David.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So this is just a really brief item for information purposes. Members recall that I reported this Scottish Minister's decision on that development at Station Yard, Nethy Bridge, under AOCB at last month's committee, and that I circulated copies of the decision documents after that meeting. So I'm not proposing to kind of run over the background to that application or that decision in any more detail today, because that was covered last time. It's really just on the agenda today to formalise our reporting of that, but just also to give another opportunity for members to raise any questions if anything has occurred, having had that opportunity to read through the decision documents, but it's more on there as a formality, essentially.
Okay, thank you, David. Do we have any questions for David? One, Mike, thank you.
Yeah, just looking at the paragraphs 37 through to 38 of the report about SEPA's reporting of flooding. I just wonder if that's the statements made within there will have any bearing on past or future planning applications which have involved flooding reports.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll be looking at obviously every case on merit. Can you point me to that paragraph reference again? So is that in the Scottish Minister's decision letter?
Apologies, it's in our report, David. So essentially what it's saying is the SEPA basically acknowledging there are uncertainties within its flood maps, and they're using a median line, and so the accuracy of their flood reports could be either too high or too low in some instances, and we're making planning decisions on the back of that, which is a bit concerning.
Yeah, I think it is, particularly in this case, it was a difficult judgment, and SEPA based their assessment on the information that they have. Scottish ministers in this case asked for additional information, I think, following the original receipt of recommendation from the DPEA. That additional information enabled them to draw a different conclusion. But yeah, I think this is an issue which, particularly with kind of the new NPF4 guidance around flooding, is a challenge that we potentially will face in future applications as well.
Does that mean, therefore, we would be recommending in future applications that people will be doing their own in-depth floods analysis when they submit a planning application?
We do, and they did in this application. So, and in this case, so our report isn't part of the papers today. So you've got the DPA reporter's report and then Scottish Minister's decision. Obviously, the DPA reporter disagreed with the planning committee and recommended refusal of the application, but ministers looked at it and asked for some further information and decided that on balance the best decision was to approve it in spite of that information on flooding, and because actually the proposed scheme would slightly reduce flood risk to neighbouring properties in the event of one of the extreme floods. I think that's information that the applicant's engineers spent a lot of time pulling together, so it's cost the applicant a lot of money to do that. But where there are cases of flooding, people have to provide flood risk information that then councils, flood risk teams and SEPA in some circumstances will look at. And in this case, there was disagreement amongst professionals on it.
Any further questions? Nope. Anything else you want to pick up during the discussion phase? Nope. Okay. Nothing online. Okay, we'll move on then. So are members content to take forward the officer recommendation? Yeah. Okay. So we'll move on to item number 9, which is AOCB. We have 3 items under AOCB, and David, you're going to take us through those.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Just a few items just to report really for information purposes. The first one is just a feedback from a visit that we had from the Scottish Government Chief Planner a couple of weeks ago. So Grant, Gavin and I met with Fiona Simpson, who is the Chief Planner at Scottish Government, and one of her colleagues on Monday the 25th of November. They came up to visit for the day. It was a really good opportunity to show them around parts of the park and discuss, I guess, some of the key planning issues that we're dealing with and addressing at the minute. We touched a lot on sort of affordable housing, the importance of funding mechanisms for that, the acute challenges we have around affordable housing and the pressures on that within the park. We also talked about some of the challenges in terms of bringing sites forward for development, some of the pressures in some of the communities in the park. So it's a really good opportunity just to show them around and raise the profile of some of that and those issues. It also gave us an opportunity to talk about some of the challenges we've been experiencing in other elements of our work as well. So particularly we raised the Shared Rural Network Programme and the kind of applications that we've had submitted through that, and then ultimately many of which were withdrawn because of concerns around sensitivities and their impacts. So it was a good opportunity to raise that. So it's basically part of an ongoing programme where we take opportunities where we can to raise the profile of planning within the park and the issues that we're dealing with. So that was just for information purposes. Happy to take was take some questions on that if it helps.
Do we have any questions for David on that subject? Nope, not online. Okay. Well, thank you. David, next one.
Yeah, so next one was just that we are proposing to bring a discussion paper to a future planning committee earlier the new year, just in terms of reviewing the planning committee standing orders and current calling criteria. So this is really following the review of the standing orders for the board at the last meeting, and also that commitment that we made at the last meeting of the board to review the calling criteria for planning applications within the park. So we're planning to bring a discussion paper to a future committee early in the new year on both of those elements as well.
Do you have any questions for David on that? No? Okay, nothing on that. We'll move on to number 3.
And then, so the final thing was just, again, for information purposes, just to draw attention to the fact that Scottish ministers have published made orders for the drilling of the A9 section between Dalruddy and Slot. So they're viewable on Transport Scotland's website. I think they were effective from the 6th of December, so basically online now from last Friday. And the detail that's included there are trunking orders, side road orders, and the CPO information as well. So that's really just the sort of final part of the statutory authorisation process for that section. As I say, it's just for information, but that is on Transport Scotland's website just now.
Thank you, David. Any questions or anything surrounding that? Nothing in the room, nothing online. Okay, no AOCB from elsewhere? Nope. Okay, so we'll move on. So that's the end of the public part of the planning committee meeting. We'll now move on to consider the minute of the confidential session on the 8th of November in a closed session. For any members of the public, the date of our next meeting will be the 24th of January 2025. So Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. And so now can we please